Hey, welcome to the Business and Society podcast. Every fortnight, we take a topic and explore with some of the influential thinkers and practitioners. I'm your host, Senthil. Today, we're going to talk about workplace dignity. And joining me is Dr. Kristen Lucas. Kristen is a professor of management in the College of Business at the University of Louisville. Her expertise centers on workplace dignity, why it matters, how it gets threatened, and what we can do to build workplaces where people's worth is protected and promoted. Kristen, such a delight to have you with me today. Thank you so much for joining me.
It is my absolute pleasure.
Lovely. I got to know about your work when I was writing a research proposal for a fellowship to Harvard. This was about workplace dignity, and I must say that you're one of the authors I've most cited, and your work has been very influential.
Thank you for those kind comments, and I loved hearing about your project as well.
When I was reading your paper about the research you did with mining workers, and thought it's yet another academic quest, but that seems to be a very strong story to your own roots. Tell us about your background and what led you to your work in workplace dignity.
Sure. So when I think about my inspiration for studying dignity, I think about three critical junctures in my life. And that first critical juncture was growing up in a small blue-collar town where, as you pointed out, the primary industry in the area was iron ore mining. And what I learned from seeing my own grandfathers and other people in the community go to work, not just in the mines, but in factories and protective services and even retail establishments and offices, was this idea that all jobs matter, that every single job is an important job, and that they all take an incredible amount of sacrifice, and that isn't always returned with rewards equal to the sacrifice made. And so one of the things that I learned also was, even though there are some jobs that are better than others, it doesn't mean that the people who get to hold those jobs and fulfill those roles are inherently better human beings than other people. So that's my worldview that I was born and raised with. And then fast forward to that second critical juncture of my life. I'm out of college. I'm pursuing my dreams to join corporate America. And I find myself in Houston, Texas, working for one of the largest, richest oil companies in the world, and found myself completely dismayed and disheartened to see how they were treating people within the company. And I don't mean me. They treated me exceptionally well because I was part of their professional class of their two-class system. But the people who were right down the hall from me, holding the jobs that were in some ways very similar to the jobs that would have been held by white-collar workers in my hometown, those were our second-class citizens. They were forbidden from applying for better jobs. They didn't get the perks. They didn't get the privileges. I was told during my interview that those people were not like us, and that they didn't like hiring them for professional positions. I also learned that I had supervisors who called them little people, but yet they were people that I considered friends and colleagues, and they would talk to me about their frustrations and their disappointments. And I found myself thinking about questions of, how do you keep people like this motivated? Why do they continue to show up? Why do they continue to do a good job? What impact is this having on our organization? What can managers do? And that's what brought me to graduate school, which is my third critical juncture. So I'm at graduate school and I'm studying equity theory and critical management studies and narrative sense making and motivation theories. And what I realize as I'm writing papers and doing research projects is that in every single paper, there's one word that appears at least once, and that word is dignity. And that's what brought me to where I am today, making this the center part of my research agenda.
That's a very powerful story. How is the landscape today, Kristen? How are people feeling in workplace?
Well, I think people are confused and frustrated. I think would be the big words that I would use. I know that AI is radically changing the way that we do work, and I teach young people, and they are so frustrated and worried about their career prospects. What is it going to mean? Are they going to be able to leverage that college education that they're working so hard for to get onto a rung in a workplace, or are those jobs getting wiped out? But I also see other people frustrated. Again, I'm using the word frustrated. There might be other emotions there, but managed by AI. Decisions made without human intervention, maybe a discrediting of the special value that they bring when parts of their jobs are outsourced to those algorithms and AI management. So I see that that is a huge challenge. I also think that there's lots of challenges when we look at work within the global landscape of that people in some ways have to work harder to not even get ahead when we look at things like the price of real estate rising, not just in the US, but I know you're in Australia and they have exorbitant real estate prices, as well as other places around the world where people are working so hard and not being able to make ends meet. And that can be a strike against dignity as well.
Could you help us understand from your research, what does workplace dignity mean? Is it getting bullied at work, or is it like devalued? How would you define it?
Sure. So dignity is one of those really interesting concepts because of the way that its meaning has evolved over time. And so let me just start back at the beginning. And at the beginning, if we go back to Roman times, there was this word dignitas, and it's the word that is the root of dignity, of dignitary. And at that time, it was a word that meant that people had special status in society, and usually reserved for folks like Roman senators and other societal elites. And in that meaning of dignity, not only did they have special status, but they also had special expectations that they were expected to comport themselves in a certain way, to uphold certain standards of ethical and moral behavior. And over time, that meaning starts to evolve. It starts to evolve through the Enlightenment, and it starts to evolve. And we see some of writings come up during the French Revolution and other places where people are starting to say dignity is not just reserved for a select few, but anyone can earn it. So by virtue of contributing to society, by doing meaningful work, by making contributions that are valued among your peers, among the citizenry, that's where dignity comes from. And that definition continues to evolve even further. And we get to the point of Immanuel Kant, who is a philosopher. And he's the one who's most closely associated with contemporary Western ideas of dignity, who says to have dignity is to be above all price. And for him, that means something can either have a price and be bought in exchange for something else, or it can't. And if it can't be exchanged, if it has just this higher incommensurable value with anything else, that's dignity. And that's where we see a lot of people circling these days. When you talk to people, at least in Western cultures, about what does dignity mean to you, they're drawing upon primarily this idea that everybody has equal dignity to all other people. But the interesting thing about it is those other two definitions haven't gone away. So it also means that I also deserve recognition and value for that which I bring through my competence and my contribution. And that also, for some people, if I have reached the pinnacle in whatever way, professionally or occupationally, they have reached that pinnacle, I deserve that special status because I comport myself and I have reached those upper echelons. So all three of those meanings kind of coalesce in today's meanings. But you brought up an interesting point when you said about bullying or regard. And I think one of the things that people have done in the past, at least from a research standpoint, is tried to equate dignity with things like bullying or the absence of bullying. And it's more than that. That might be something that injures dignity, but it's not dignity itself. Ultimately, dignity is your self-recognized worth that you see in yourself and your perception that important others see it in you as well.
Right. Is this something what you call as earned and inherent dignity? The inherent dignity is that the Kantian ideals of every humans deserve respect, whereas earned is something you earn from your work.
Yes, that's correct. And there's actually a lot of debate among scholarly folks, anyway, about whether or not earned dignity can even exist. Because if you genuinely believe in the definition that all people have equal value inherent to their humanity, then there's nothing that they can do that can take that away or give somebody more than anybody else. And so, how could it possibly be then that there is earned dignity? And I think that for me, the answer always is, or always has been, of course, there's also earned dignity, because when you talk to people and you say, what is it that gives you dignity? When have you felt it? And when have you not felt it? They always, in workplace contexts, have a tendency to bring up issues of their competence and their contribution. So for me, that earned component is absolutely essential.
That's also one of the sense of market economics we operate in, right? I mean, perfect equality in terms of
Mm-hmm.
treatment may be a controversial point for some.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Tell us from your research, what are some of the common conditions that threatens dignity?
When I think about workplace dignity and the conditions that threaten it, I'm thinking about it in terms of three big buckets. That would be inequality, instrumentality, and disrespect. And as you pointed out, inequality is a controversial topic. And I think for a lot of people, even when you talk to people at the lowest ranks, they're not desiring perfect equality. They still want gradations and incentives, rungs on the ladder. But this idea that there is some base level of equity where contributions are valued in a meaningful way, such that, for example, that somebody who is working full time is making enough money in the United States that they are not at the same time qualifying for federal food assistance. That would be an example of perhaps a broader level of inequality. The second bucket is issues of instrumentality. And this is the idea where people are treated as a means unto an end. And that's one of the challenges always in a workplace, because workplaces are in many ways instrumental. People are hired to fulfill roles. And so that's something that is inescapable. But if they are treated only as instruments that get the job done and not also human beings who are doing the job, that can create dignity threats. And so when individuals are constantly threatened with termination as a means of control, that could be seen as a way of exacerbating that inequality. When their health and safety is completely disregarded and proper protections are not provided and known safety concerns are not addressed, that is something that treats people as an instrument, an exchangeable instrument, instead of a valued human being. And then that third category is disrespect. And this can come from those interpersonal interactions of disrespect, whether that is things like workplace bullying or abusive supervision or incivility in the workplace. But it can also come from disrespect that comes from broader cultural discourses of what occupations are positively regarded and which are disparaged, or which jobs are privileged and which are stigmatized. And so being somebody who's in an occupation that is stigmatized or disparaged can be a real threat to somebody's dignity, because it's signaling that the other does not perceive or recognize their inherent worth.
Do you see any sectors or professions that are most vulnerable to the three violations you talked about?
Well, I think just from a very practical standpoint, the jobs that are low rung jobs tend to have a lot of threats that are wrapped up in them because usually it is the bottom rung low status jobs where you have more opportunities for low wages, first of all, so you might have inequality. If there are jobs that require less training, less special skills, those individuals may be treated as more expendable because that skill set is more easily exchangeable or replaceable from a staffing standpoint. And then those individuals, especially if they're in the customer service sector, might not only be experiencing supervisor abuse or abusive supervision, but they might also be on the receiving end of abuse from customers as well. And so when you look at those low wage service employees, you're kind of getting it from all angles, and that makes them particularly vulnerable.
Interesting you talked about customers. I know how recently you traveled to Australia. So you walk into a school, hospital, or a public transportation, or a nearby post office, you can see a board that says that you treat our employees with respect.
We did do some studies where we were interviewing people from a broad cross section of occupations, and there were quite a few customer service providers in there: oil change attendants, bartenders, concessionaires, baristas. And it seemed that that they all told a lot of stories of being subjected to abusive customers and whether they had specific instances where their managers were telling them that they couldn't defend themselves. They also felt beholden to, particularly in the US, tips. So if you speak back, you could be risking getting a tip. And if that's a really large part of your income, a lot of them felt powerless to speak back.
Tell us the nexus of dignity and things like race at workplace, gender at workplace, how that interacts.
Sure. So there is a concept in the dignity literature that talks about different kinds of inequalities. And there's a differentiation made between what are called identity indifferent markers and identity sensitive. And so identity indifferent inequalities are those kinds of inequalities that are made without regard to the human being who is on the receiving end. An example would be of all entry-level employees make minimum wage in this company. So regardless of what your identity is, you might have that experience. When it comes to things like race and gender, that's where you get your identity sensitive markers. And this is where racism, sexism, all of the isms might come in. And this is when people are treated in ways that are different simply because of who they are. Now, a lot of this, again, it has been at least made illegal by human resource practices. So there should be some sort of path of recourse for individuals facing this, but there absolutely are different experiences that are held by people who have these different identity markers. I did some research a number of years back with a PhD student of mine, Sarah Baker from Southern Connecticut State University. And she interviewed LGBT employees to talk about their specific experiences of dignity at work. And bullying and distasteful jokes and threats directly because of their sexuality were very commonplace for these employees. And so dignity for them was finding a place where their sexuality could become a non-issue. So absolutely, identity markers do make a difference for experiencing dignity at work.
So, if a leader listening to this and say that, okay, if I want to preserve dignity in our workplace, what is the case there?
Well, I mean, the case is that feeling dignified, self-recognized is wonderful, but knowing that other people experience that or perceive that in you as well is a very powerful motivating factor for individuals. And so what you are going to have are people who are more motivated to work. They are more engaged. They're more satisfied with their jobs. And there's so much that comes out of that. I've done some research recently with some colleagues in Austria, Timo Müller and some others. And we have actually shown that employees can be more creative, come up with better ideas, and be more willing to champion those ideas through to implementation simply by promising them an environment of dignity. So that's a really powerful motivator. And on the flip side, people who experience indignity, they're stressed out. They want to leave, so intent to turn over is high. Their mental capacity to deal with issues is decreased. So obviously, dignity is a wonderful investment for organizations. And the great thing about it is a lot of it doesn't cost a lot of money.
And you talk a lot about the importance of communications
Mhm.
in ensuring workplace dignity. Tell us how communication helps in preserving dignity at workplace.
Yeah, communication, I think, is the key. In a lot of ways, almost all of these threats that I talked about earlier, instrumentality and inequality and respect, they all have these very strong communicative elements to them. So if you have, for example, a situation where employees aren't performing and you have supervisors who are able to talk to them and hold them accountable and correct that behavior while still preserving their dignity at the same time, that is going to be such a powerful thing in your organization for not only preserving people's dignity, but also improving their performance. Research also shows that even simple things, saying thank you, doing shout outs at meetings. Some of my colleagues and I did interviews with white collar workers about when they felt dignity. And when they felt dignity was when their bosses pulled them aside and said, I think you're ready for a stretch project, and then celebrated them at the next meeting. Like, if that's how easy it is to generate dignity, particularly in this group among sort of middle level white collar professionals, why would organizations not try to pursue dignity actively?
It's very simple. What stops people or leaders from doing that?
That is a really good question. And I have asked that before. If it is really so simple, why do we get it wrong so much? And I think that one reason why is that maybe we are just fatigued and not thinking about our actions before we go to speak. And so a manager might say something not thinking how it will affect the other people. It's not taking that step back before that communication interaction and saying, okay, how do I do this? What are their motivations? What do they care about? So instead of reacting, be proactive about those conversations. And I just don't think we do that great of a job of it. But that's one potential solution. I think another reason why maybe we are not so good at it is our empathy is really down. So again, when I talked earlier about these different meanings of dignity, whether it's about that you have equal dignity to other people or special dignity because of your competence and contribution or extra special status dignity because of that accomplishment. If you don't recognize where other employees are at in what is going to make them feel dignified, you may miss that what you're saying to them is possibly something that's threatening their sense of self-worth. So it's just taking that time to get into the headspace of thinking about people want to be respected. They want their competence and contribution recognized, or at least acknowledge that they're trying to be competent and trying to make a contribution. Just starting there is a huge step in the right direction.
How can a leader measure or understand how their employee is feeling in the workplace? How do they measure dignity?
That is a great question. I I developed a scale with one of my colleagues. Now, it's a scale that's a good size for academic measurement, probably too long for day-to-day business use, but even a couple items on a pulse survey of do you feel dignity? Just that explicit, putting that on a pulse survey might be really insightful in getting those results. 2 or 3 items, just I feel like that my dignity is upheld when I come to work, or maybe something like I feel that other people at work treat me with dignity can be something that's really revealing. And those are some items that are on that larger 18-item scale.
And what are some of the consequences for organizations for not preserving dignity? Some of the thing we often hear is, attrition. People leave for better places, and obviously the most talented leave earlier. But what does your research say?
Well, that's exactly the kinds of things that you would expect. And I have not studied a whole bunch on everything that it could be. So I haven't done the statistical analyses on outcomes. But what I can say is that in my interviews of people, understanding what threatens their dignity and doesn't, the big things that I hear are disengaged employees, employees who get bad attitudes, uh, and are more likely to quit. I've heard people talking about no calls, no shows at work as one of the ways that they resist these efforts. And that's very costly to businesses. I've also heard people talking about and self-reporting that they will engage in bad-mouthing customers, not very far from where customers are, and that can be really bad for business. I've heard people self-report that they've engaged in retaliation against other employees or the source of their employer, things from causing fights to petty pranks to things like theft. So there's definite costs as people retaliate.
And how are things like artificial intelligence impacts workplace dignity?
I do think that AI is definitely it's changing so much of what we do. And I think that one of the interesting things that I see, an interesting contradiction with the rise of AI, is my work originally, I started out studying blue collar workers. And what we saw with those blue collar workers is that they felt in a lot of cases that they were looked down upon by white collar workers who had cushier jobs, more reward, who maybe saw those positions as being better than those blue collar jobs. But now in the age of AI, particularly where we have perhaps entry level employees who don't have the skill set and the wisdom and the deep knowledge of an industry to make an impact much larger than AI is able to do, it's kind of reversing, flipping that script a little bit, because what we see is that those blue collar workers, we know that that work is real. You know when the stonemason has finished that wall. You know when the electrician has finished that wiring. And you know that their expertise was used for that. That is not so clear now with that frontline, bottom rung, white collar worker who might be over relying on AI. So I think that there may be, in some ways, a silver lining for some blue collar workers where they see some dignity restored with the advent of artificial intelligence.
But suppose I'm a leader listening to this podcast. What are 1 or 2 immediate steps I can take to ensure dignity is preserved in my workplace?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that organizations can do is to get a real sense of how people are being managed kind of down the line. So if we are looking at how supervisors are managing front level employees, I think that's where organizations can probably make the biggest difference for overall dignity. And that's by asking employees what kind of dignity they are experiencing, and maybe that measurement question of where's that source, right? So if they're not being uniformly treated with respect, where is it that they're saying that? And if the answer comes out as supervisors, which research shows that it's often a supervisor that's causing that, that's a great place to do an intervention. Maybe some training with frontline and supervisors as a way to build their capacity to manage for greater dignity. I might also take a look at the larger the organization as a whole to see if there are critical differences, whether that's between different verticals in the organization. You were talking about along the value chain. Is there something a little bit downstream where there is a critical need? And I'd be trying to look at where's the low hanging fruit? Where can I make that the biggest impact immediately?
Okay, Kristen, we are moving to the final section. I call it
Okay.
as how I did it. And I
Okay.
ask all my guests 3 standard questions,
Okay.
more to learn from their own experiences and lives. How do you manage differences of opinion at your work?
Hmm. Well, I work in a university, and one thing that is true about professors is that they all have an opinion and they're just about all different. So, this is something that we do on a regular basis. I think that one of the things that I have tried to do is to do lots of listening. In one of my roles, I was in an associate dean role. So, in a position of leadership within that academic organization, people would come in and I would hear them out. So there were lots of times where I'd say, well, there's more than one side of the story. So just give me your side of the story. So that's the first step. I think the second step is extended conversations, right? Having people share one side, sharing the other side, maybe teasing out pros and cons or what trying to get at the root of what their position is to try to uncover what their interest is and really getting at those issues can help really patch some of those differences of opinion.
What are some of the key skills essential for business leaders today?
Well, of course, I'm going to say communication. That's part of my background. And I think communication is broad. Yes, it's speaking, but it's also listening. And I think even more critical today is finding a way to be authentic in your communication so people know that it is genuinely from the heart. It's not an AI crafted email message that is going out or some automated response that people are getting once certain criteria are met, but that there's a genuine human being on the other end. And I think another absolutely critical skill is, and I mentioned this earlier, but it's this idea of empathy, like really trying to understand where people are coming from, not making assumptions about what motivates them, because really having that concern and that empathy for others, I think, is just a skill that is going to help people make good decisions about how any situation needs to play out.
One book you recommend to our listeners,
Can I give two?
please.
Okay. So if I had to recommend one book for people who are interested in dignity, it would be a very old one. About 25 years ago, Catherine Newman wrote a book called No Shame in My Game, where she followed fast food workers in Harlem and tried to understand how they negotiated the pains of low wage work and kept showing up. And I think it's a great book. It's showing threats to dignity, ongoing identity work, management interventions. And so that's just a very, very powerful read. But I feel pretty bad suggesting a book that's 25 years old. So let me suggest a new one, and that is Rethinking Dignity by Laura Mitchell. And that came out in the past year. And she really takes a relational approach to dignity and really sees dignity as an accomplishment of respectful relations at and around work. And I think that that is definitely worth reading as well.
Kristen, what a pleasure talking to you today. Idea like dignity is so underspoken about at workplaces, and scholars like you who are leading this piece of work has been a tremendous influence. So thank you so much for your work, and such a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you, Senthil. It was just a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate having this conversation with you.
Excellent. That was Dr. Kristen Lucas sharing insights on workplace dignity. You've been listening to Business and Society podcast, where we explore diverse ideas about business and society with some of the influential thinkers and leaders. If you enjoyed this conversation, please follow or subscribe wherever you listen, and share it with someone interested in the intersection of business, purpose, and impact. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.